Hello and welcome to the Red Zone Podcast. We're talking about tight ends and analysis. I'm Big Italy 42 here with Scott Mailwig, the author of this article here. And as any tight end piece should, I mean, we probably should begin and end with Rob Gronkowski, but you can't just write his name twice. So we'll begin with Rob Gronkowski and just tell you, I mean, we can go into depth about this. It's not an ideal matchup, but there's no such thing as a bad matchup for Rob Gronkowski. He's literally unstoppable. He is the most dominant player in the entire NFL. And if you're not playing him in your cash games, I'm not sure how we could possibly help you with anything else. And that sounds like your problem that we can't fix. But his GPP ownership is, I guess, what's up for grabs here, depending on how much exposure you're going to have with him in GPPs. But he's a 100% must play in cash games for me.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, for an example, I think he was, like 30% or so in Thursday games last week when not only was he the best tight end play like he usually is, but he was also playing on Thursday, which usually increases his ownership percentage. If he's 30%, I mean, I'm just going to play him every time. And, I mean, it's just so hard to argue against him. I mean, we saw 3 touchdowns week 1. Yeah, it's a tough matchup, but it's a tough matchup for everybody on the Patriots, and he's their best player. So I assume he'll get even more usage than he did last week. He didn't have a monster game target or catches-wise last week.
He's efficient.
Right. I mean, he just scores touchdowns. That's all Gronk does.
Yep.
So, I mean, he's the number one tight end play for me. There are other guys I like this week, but even at the increased price, I have a hard time passing him up.
Yeah, it seems like one of those, everyone's talking about how it's a tough matchup for the Bills, or for Gronkowski against the Bills. It's really a tougher matchup for the Bills against Gronkowski, if you ask me. So
yeah, definitely.
Maybe don't play the Bills instead of fading Gronk. Maybe that's the way you go. But, yeah, anyway, next up, another guy who's going to be popular this week. Maybe some people play him in cash games instead, and I mean, it's not the worst idea in the world, but I won't be doing it. Jason Witten, obviously going to see a bump in targets and receptions and all this because of Des Bryant being out, as we saw in the fourth quarter.
Yep.
Tony Romo just looks to him almost exclusively in the clutch with Des Bryant out. And, I mean, you knew the ball was going to him. They still didn't stop him. So even at his ripe old age, I don't know what he is now, 32, 33 maybe. But, I mean, the guy is one of the best possession tight ends in all of football. And not a deep threat by any means ever. But, I mean, he's a guy that gets volume. He gets red zone looks. And, I mean, he's only $4,300. He's cheap this week. So, I mean, we saw the Eagles. I mean, this is just not a good defense. Like, they didn't give up much to tight ends in week 1, but they also were playing a team that essentially doesn't even have a worthwhile tight end on their roster.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good matchup. I mean, they were, 10th in effectiveness against tight ends last year. That's good, but not great. And like you mentioned, not everybody has a tight end like Gronkowski or Witten. So, tight end numbers can get skewed a lot based on strength of schedule and many other factors. I think Witten sees 10, 12, maybe even more targets this week. I don't see him being the red zone guy that he was in week 1 where he scored 2 touchdowns, but someone's got to catch passes in the red zone for the Cowboys, and he's as good a bet as any. So I think there's a lot of upside here. I can definitely see playing him in cash games over Gronk. I prefer Gronk, but I'll mix some Witten in there. He's a very good play at $4,300. I don't even mind playing both of them together. I think they're both really good plays at their prices this week on both sites. Obviously, you can only play both of them on sites with a flex, so it takes that out of the equation on FanDuel, but I think these are far and away the top 2 tight end plays, and then we can move on to some, I mean, one of my value plays is more expensive than Witten, so you can see just how cheap Witten is for how good of a play he is.
Yeah, that's a great point there, so certainly a viable strategy getting both those guys in there, and as we saw, week 1 was the week of the tight end, so we'll see if that continues, but another guy, huge, big target, a pretty big part of the offense, obviously taking on a little bit more now that Brandon Marshall isn't in town. But Martellus Bennett for the Bears. This is an offense that a lot of people expected wasn't going to play well in week 1, and they did produce. I mean, Cutler still had his issues, but when you got targets like Martellus Bennett and Matt Forte in the passing game and Alshon Jeffrey, there's plenty to go around, and it's tough for the opposing defense, even a good defense, to key on any one of these guys to try and stop him. So Martellus Bennett, one of those guys, I mean, due to his size alone, pretty tough cover in the red zone.
Yeah, definitely. And, I mean, Arizona's a team that's always forced people in the middle of the field. They've been forgiving to tight ends in the past. They're so good on the outside with Patrick Peterson and the rest of that secondary that they just kind of force things to the middle. I think Forte and Bennett are both going to see a ton of looks over the middle of the field this week while Jeffrey's locked up with Peterson. So I think Bennett's a really solid contrarian play to Witten. Another guy that if you're going away from Gronk and playing 2 tight ends together, I don't mind both Bennett and Witten in this one. And then the next guy that is on this list as a value play. Jordan Reed is actually cheaper than Witten, which is nice to see because you can consider playing him over Witten, although I'd probably spend the extra $600 on DraftKings. I think it's a 1K price difference on FanDuel where it makes it a little bit tougher. But, I mean, Reed saw a ton of targets, no Deshaun Jackson. We talked about this in the wide receiver podcast with Pierre Garcon. They're going to pass. They're probably going to be down at some point in this game. If not for most of the game against the St. Louis team that looked really good against the Seahawks last week.
Yep.
And they just don't have a ton of weapons in the passing game after Garcon and Reed. So I'm expecting both of them to be in double-digit targets in this game pretty easily.
Yeah, and like you mentioned here, those 11 targets week one. I mean, that was among the leaders really at any position. I mean, he was up there, I believe, top 15. So when you're getting that type of production at that price at tight end, I mean, definitely a viable strategy to get him in there as well. And I don't know that he quite has the upside of those other guys, but certainly a nice high floor because Kirk Cousins definitely has a nice rapport with him. Next up, the guy that people were comparing to Gronkowski a couple of years ago, obviously now in a less than ideal situation with his offense, but for that reason, I mean, talent-wise, he's still the same guy he always was. 49-point over-under in this one. Should be a shootout, I guess, if you can call that, because we saw 65 points in Seattle's first game. Of course, you expect with Cam Chancellor out that Aaron Rodgers and the Packers are going to score some points. So Jimmy Graham, he did get a touchdown in week one, caught 6 of 8 targets, like you said here, for 51 yards. So this is a guy that's a volume guy. He's a great threat in the red zone, and he's not quite Gronkowski, but he's pretty hard to stop across the middle as well.
Yeah, I mean, he's not going to have those like 16 target games we saw sometimes with Drew Brees probably, but I mean, if he's going 8 to 12 targets most games, which it looks pretty likely, he's going to have a lot of red zone chances. The Seahawks have nothing at wide receiver, especially in the red zone.
Yep.
I mean, Doug Baldwin's their best wide receiver, I guess, still. So, I mean, we saw Graham get 3 looks in the red zone out of those 8 targets this week, scored a touchdown on one of them, obviously. He's going to get those jump balls thrown to him at times. He's going to be utilized pretty well, I think, by the Seahawks. Maybe not as voluminously as he was with the Saints, but I think you're going to see a ton of scoring chances and him be a decent PPR guy for most of the season. Like you said, he's not as good as Witten or Gronkowski this week in terms of value. He's kind of in the price range in between those two guys. He's going to be under-owned, which is why I like him quite a bit as a GPP play. He has definite 2-3 touchdown upside in any given game.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point there with his ownership, because this was a guy that, even last year, it was some weeks it was, do you play Jimmy Graham or do you play Gronkowski? So, I mean, it's still the same guy. It's just a different offense. So, certainly a guy that with some big upside. Next up, Jordan Cameron, the Dolphins. I mean, he's a guy who's been effective really throughout his young career whenever he's been healthy. Even with the Browns and a terrible offense, he had some big games there. Ended up with 71 yards in the first week, and that was while Miami as an offense, as their offense as a whole, really struggled. So, got to expect that they'll be able to get it going a little bit more this week. I don't know it was a sluggish kind of start for them, but certainly not a tough matchup against Jacksonville. And with a 24-point team total here and only a 42 over/under, you got to expect that the Miami offense finally gets it going.
Yeah, definitely. Like you mentioned, I mean, Miami said they admittedly struggled even though they won that game, and they took a 17-10 lead with a good 13 minutes to go in the game and basically ran it every play after that. So he really only was a part of the game for 3 quarters. It's hard to argue him against guys like Witten and Bennett and stuff like that in a similar price range, but he's going to be a sub 5% owned guy that has a ton of upside. I mean, we've seen him run the seams before. He's been a red zone target, so not necessarily a guy I'm super excited about playing in a ton of lineups, but he definitely has GPP potential based on ownership and upside.
Yeah, and even more so because he's so similarly priced to those other guys like Jason Witten and Jordan Reed that people are going to look right past him. They're going to scroll down, find Jason Witten, and kind of move on. So a guy like that, similarly priced, definitely going to see really low ownership this week.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, that's going to wrap things up. Find us on Twitter, once again, at DF Cafe. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Lots of great content for this weekend's NFL action, MLB, and everything else at dailyfantasycafe.com.